Welcome. Thanks for joining us today for the University of Minnesota's China Center's Considering China webinar, the China-U.S. Tangle, Handle with Care with Professor David Lampton. I'm Joe Brzezinski and I direct the China Center, and we're so happy to have you here. There will be a Q&A section directly following the presentation, and I'd like you to submit your questions throughout the program if you have them at the Q&A function at the bottom of your screen. We'll answer as many questions as we can as it is possible at the end of the program. Professor Lampton is a senior research fellow and professor emeritus at the Johns Hopkins School of Advanced International Studies on Foreign Policy, the Foreign Policy Institute at SAIS. He's also a professor emeritus. He served as the Hyman Professor and Director of China Studies at SAIS, a former chairman of the Asia Foundation in San Francisco, former president of the National Committee on U.S. China Relations in New York, and former dean of the faculty of SAIS. His many publications, academic and popular, are dealing with the U.S. China relations, Chinese foreign policy, Chinese leadership, Chinese politics, Chinese power. His first publication in 1974, Health Conflict in Chinese Political System, often cited as the Politics of Medicine in China Policy Process from 1949 to 1977, is a seminal work that explored the complex interplay of competing interest groups, doctors, political organizations, consumers, bureaucratic models, and challenging Maoist ideals by showing how these factions influence policy. Much of his early analysis still remains significant and was relevant in understanding China's approach to COVID. I have really enjoyed his latest book, Living U.S. China Relations from Cold War to Cold War. This book examines 50 plus years of the U.S.-China relationship. It's a history of the U.S. policy and its missteps, misunderstandings, and missed opportunities for a more equitable and peaceful relationship with China. It's an invitation to witness the evolution of this critical engagement from someone who lived and breathed this work. Welcome, Professor Lampton.
Well, thank you, Joan, and good afternoon. It's just good afternoon for you. I'm an hour into the good afternoon. So anyway, I'm glad to speak with once again with the University of Minnesota and your global audience. So I do want to thank you, Joan and Haiyan Wang, for all the effort I know goes into such a program. I guess I would start by saying I don't think I can overstate the importance of the moment we're in U.S.-China relations. I'm not predicting, better, significantly better relations. I think the likelihood is probably they will deteriorate over time. But I think for the next year, conceding that things are uncertain, I think we might look for some opportunities to put the bilateral relationship on a more sound footing. And so I sort of want to build with that idea. Lots of problems. We are in a moment of some opportunity. If we wanted to seize those opportunities, what might we do? And the we doesn't just mean the United States capitulating on all issues. It means we, the Chinese, and us finding ways to sort of square the circle, to find areas of commonality that are strong enough to, I think, at least make manageable those issues where we significantly disagree. So dangers, opportunities, work for the best, but don't necessarily think that's the only outcome. So that's sort of my little brief summary. I just got back from the last 2 weeks, two trips, one to Hong Kong and then a separate trip to Beijing. Had many impressions, and you might want to ask during Q&A what some of them were. But I think what jumped out at me as somebody who's been to China over the last almost 60 years, is the, I don't want to say absence, but the depopulation of what I would call Western faces on the landscape of China. Whatever's happening is manifest, it seems to me, by the absence of not only tourists, but academic exchange, at least Americans going to China and so forth. It's visible. And many of the sort of, we might say, Caucasian faces we see aren't Americans or North Americans or Europeans. They're often Russians. So it's not just an abstraction that relations are tenuous with China, but it's apparent just walking on the street and interacting with people. I should also say most of the Chinese I met were excited to see Westerners and us as well. So I think they're feeling that separation as well. Now, I want to call it. I got back on last Friday from China, and on Sunday morning got up with the New York Times and noticed two articles that you might want to go back and take a look at. And they remind one of what the first Cold War with China meant. And I think one of the themes in my remarks will be we want to do our best to avoid a second Cold War, which I think we're unfortunately well on the road to having. Uh, the first article in the New York Times was about um, a radioactive atomic battery powered monitoring device that we put on the second tallest mountain in India, and it got lost and is still up there emitting presumably radioactive material. And it explained why we wanted to put that up during the first Cold War in the this was done in the early 1960s. And it brings home how many things can go wrong when relations with China are bad. So it's a fascinating story. Take a look at it. The other article was called Overstretched. The U.S. alone cannot outbuild China. And one thing we've got to get into our, I think, calculations is that China's got lots of problems. And as Americans, we'd never want the set of problems China has, but it also has deep pockets of excellence and competitiveness. And the scale of China's movement forward, the United States is only 4% of the world's people. And China's got its problems, but it has great capacity for innovation. And we need as many friends in the world as we can and cooperative relationships to just simply compete against the mass and capability of China. In other words, message is don't underestimate China. Uh, Now, we shouldn't underestimate ourselves. Neither of us should overestimate our capacity. So, how we judge each other's power and intentions is a controversial matter, but it produces huge problems when we overestimate our strength and underestimate the Chinese. Of course, they have the same problem in reverse. Now, another contextual thing I want to put for our discussion is in late November, in the dead of night, the current administration in Washington, the Trump administration, issued what I have to say is a remarkable national security strategy. Remarkable, I mean, not just that I endorse all of its propositions or that, in fact, that I think most of them are wise. That's not the case, but it is different. I would say from the second Obama administration through the into the start of the second Trump administration, the U.S. had I didn't think it was particularly a wise policy, but it was consistent across administrations. And the strategy was based on the presumption that China was our singular, most important long-term threat to values and interests. And that was consistent from really late Obama into the current administration. The new national security strategy that's been issued is really a dramatic departure. And it's very clear. Now, by departure and clear, I don't mean it's wise. that is worthy of a lot of conversation. But it is different. And in what regards is it different? First, it, and this is my vocabulary, but I think it moves us towards thinking about the world of the future as spheres of influence. Roughly, Russia in charge of the space that resembles the old Soviet Union, the United States enlarged presence and dominance in the Western Hemisphere, all the way from Iceland to the Straits of Juan de Fuca, and then China by implication in its region in East and Northeast and Southeast Asia. You have to decide what you think about spheres of influence as an attempt to make our relationship with China more manageable by limiting the geographic scope of competition. But on the other hand, the 19th century, where spheres of influence dominated, and into the 20th century, were conflict starters and initiators, and it was not a peaceful period, and it was one of effectively colonialism or semi-colonialism. But leave aside the analysis, I think one thing in the strategy is an implicit spheres of influence idea, which would give China a freer hand in Asia, Russia a freer hand on Eurasia, and certainly the United States in the Western Hemisphere. So that's a big departure, and you have to decide what you think about that. Secondly, and I'm more sympathetic to this part of the strategy, it very clearly says the United States cannot be Atlas, holding up the world on its shoulders alone. It states the proposition that the United States has been overstretched, spending too much of its national treasure and blood abroad and paying insufficient attention at home. Now, as a statement, you all have your own opinion. My own view is there's some merit to that. But on the other hand, don't want to drift towards isolationism, because we're a connected world, and what other people do matters, and what we do matters. So, but in any case, it's the idea that the U.S. is more limited capability. We have to limit in a greater degree the commitments we make. Certainly, another aspect of the new national security strategy is that we, therefore, because we have limited capabilities and we're moving towards spheres of influence, that we need to refocus away a bit. Asia's a little unclear in the strategy, but certainly in the Middle East, we need to reduce our commitments there. The next thing is that, contradictorily, of course, the idea is that the United States should still be a preeminent, dominant power. So how you square the circle of being a dominant global power and yet pull in your horns, so to speak, and limit your commitments, that's what I would call an unresolved contradiction in this document. So anyway, I would encourage all of you to take a look. It's not a long document. Most national security strategies go on for a lot longer than this one, but this one is very clear about its priorities. It has contradictions. It certainly raises value issues. But the point is, for our discussion today, it's very important in where U.S.-China relations are going and how the Chinese will react over time to this strategy as opposed to the previous one. So that's just sort of context. Now, to me, this raises is the question I want to really chat with you about, and then in our Q&A we can talk about, is, are we in a Cold War right now? And do we face a moment where we can step back? Does this national security strategy and other developments, do they give us both, the Chinese and us, the opportunity to step back in a more constructive way than we've been interacting really since 2010, and certainly since Xi Jinping came to power in 2012, 2013, and most dramatically, I would say, uh, up until the present time. Now, one of the things that I want to talk to you about is what are the clear and present dangers that we face in our relationship with China? Secondly, I just want to tick off what I think from my own experience, and I think most people who have looked at the first Cold War and our interaction with China, what are some historical lessons? So, what are the dangers? What are the lessons? And thirdly, given all of that, what do I see as the current opportunities to make things better? And fourthly, what would those specific measures look like? So let me just deal with those four questions briefly, and hopefully we'll have a lively and interactive discussion. Now, as to clear and present dangers, it seems to me that the relationship, quite frankly, has been getting worse and worse since the second Obama administration. That's 2013 to 2017. Now, if we really got into a deep discussion, some people could argue the relationship got worse in 2015 when we had an imbroglio, or I should say 1995, when we had an imbroglio with Taiwan. Others would say it got worse in 2010 when Secretary of State Clinton and the administration adopted the so-called pivot of reorienting our policy more aimed at China. Uh, some would say it really got going when Xi Jinping became China's supreme leader. So the point is, you can argue about when things really began to go downhill. But I would just say, broadly speaking, the second Obama administration is very important, and the rise of Xi Jinping. And then, of course, Trump got elected after Obama, and things went downhill further. Biden came in, and many people thought he would improve relations with China, and au contraire, basically, deserves more discussion. But Biden pretty much adhered to Trump's policies. And so Trump comes back, and now, in some sense, he's issued this new security strategy that changes direction again. So if you say the first thing about U.S. China relations is the Chinese are confused at this point. What is our policy? What is our long-term intention? What are our short-term actions? And how can China, on the first hand, resist them and induce the Americans to change their policy? So that's the first thing I would say. Now, the first Cold War was really it was an arms race that drove all our other policies. And so, what are some of the lessons that we learned in that first Cold War? And the point is, I see the current developments as not entirely the same as the first Cold War, but there are remarkable and I think worrisome similarities. So I'm not arguing the so-called second Cold War is exactly the same as the first, but I am arguing that we better learn from the lessons of the first. The first thing I would say about what's happened in the first Cold War was all about deterrence. It was deterring the Soviet Union from developing, much less using, weapons that could inflict crippling or existential threats to the United States. And this competition, of course, started out in the late 50s with the launch of Sputnik and the race in space, but it also was a period when we built alliances one against the other. We fought proxy wars in far off places, most notable of which was Vietnam, that about 55 to 58,000 Americans were killed in over a decade. Uh, we so we had that, and also we had the buildup of military ground forces. We lived in constant fear. I was a child. I had to crawl under my desk, and it was duck and cover. Put the hand behind the neck and hope you don't see a blinding flash. So this was a period of anxiety, technological competition. All kids were going into engineering to fight for the free world. It was a very ideological, mobilizational period, and in China and the Soviet Union as well. So, what were some of the lessons that we learned in the first Cold War? Uh, uh, Joan Brzezinski was kind enough to mention my book. It's really the personal story of U.S. China relations as I saw it through the first Cold War and its end. And I think there are a number of lessons we learned from that period from, 19, let's just say 19, late 1940s up until 1991 with the dissolution of the Soviet Union. And of course, just before that, the United States and China had improved their relations to fight now their common enemy, the Soviet Union. In any case, one of the dangers that we saw very clearly in the Cold War was the danger of accidental war. And it's a long story. It's very interesting. I think many people would be interested in it. It was an accidental war. When the North Koreans crossed the 38th parallel and attacked South Korea in mid 1950, the United States did not expect that. Uh, we were trying to get a more peaceful post-war world where people could come home and have families. The World War ended in 45, and bingo, in mid 1950, we find ourselves in a war on the Korean Peninsula. Needless to say, many Americans didn't know much about Korea at all, and we found ourselves in a war. Uh, Probably about 50 plus thousand Americans died in that war. And in the process of prosecuting the war, the Chinese entered that war, which we thought they would never do because they had just fought a civil war. And before that, they had fought the Japanese. We assumed that the Chinese were too weak to take us on. Well, they did, and they fought us to a standstill at the 38th parallel where the war began. So the first lesson I learned from that first Cold War is you can make mistakes. You can underestimate the power of your adversary. You can underestimate their willingness to undertake punishing actions to stop what they see as your aggressive behavior. So I would say when you get into a Cold War period like I think we are entering, the don't underestimate the capacity for people to misjudge and end up in a conflict. Uh, so that's the first thing I think is a lesson. A second thing is these things tend to spill over. The Korean War started out with the United States and the United Nations trying to stop North Korea, but before long, we were fighting China, as I just explained. In Vietnam, from the really the 50s, but certainly the 60s and into the mid 70s, we were in a war in Vietnam. It was a proxy war. It's true our principal adversaries were North Vietnam and the Viet Cong and South Vietnam, but China had covertly and semi-covertly over time 350,000 troops in North Vietnam and a very few in South Vietnam, as we learned. So when you fight on the periphery of China, you can end up in a fight with China. The Korean War, it was overt. In the Vietnam War, it was more covert. Certainly, another thing is that when these conflicts get going, one power after the next the powers begin to align with each other to fight each other. We're in a way seeing that now in Ukraine. Russia attacks Ukraine, the Europeans get involved. They ask for the Americans to get involved, the Americans get involved. The Chinese are involved, although in a very, I would say, subtle and behind the scenes way. But it does have the possibility of bringing the United States, its allies, and China into higher levels of friction, which could include trade sanctions, could include the Chinese selling lethal weapons to the Russians. Already, the North Koreans are sending troops to fight with the Russians. So the next lesson of the Cold War period is these big power conflicts tend to cascade, and even if there were modest objectives and modest levels of conflict to start, they don't often stay that way. So I think those are some lessons. Also, the costs of the Cold War in economic terms were enormous. In fact, the Cold War ended in 1991, we had the era of Bill Clinton and the peace dividend and incomes in the 1990s and globalization. The United States, after the era of globalization, is further ahead of China in per capita GNP than before. There were many people in many segments, and the Rust Belt, where I lived in Ohio, globalization imposed enormous uh, losses on segments and areas of countries, including China. But on balance, it was a period of remarkable growth owing to free trade, more market incentives. All of that was foregone during the first Cold War and produced huge economic inefficiencies and poverty for the world. And once the first Cold War ended, we had enormous growth, it had problems, and now we're living with the fallout from unhappy people and segments of the population. But nonetheless, it was a boost to economic efficiency. Unfortunately, economic equality suffered enormously as well. So the last thing I would say is that arms races, it's like fighting in a jungle without any formal weapons. You pick up whatever you find on the jungle floor and begin to beat your opponent with that. Well, the Cold War that we're engaging in now is moving across technologies, things we didn't even have as weapons in the first Cold War. Certainly, cyber, in conventional war and the Cold War and World War II and so forth, lots of damage, not to underestimate it by any means. But on the other hand, now with cyber tools, you can affect public infrastructure, power grids, financial, medical records, social security files. All of this is a new area that we're increasingly competing in now. Uh, so I think that's certainly something to think about. AI, we're just beginning to get our mind around how AI could be used for purposes of conflict. Autonomous weapons, just as the most obvious, but disinformation and so forth. So what bothers me is that this increasing conflict and friction with China is spreading to more areas of technology with more and thus far not fully known capacity to cause disruption and casualties and large spread destruction. So that's sort of the prism that I bring to this. Now, what are some of the windows of opportunity that I see? Yeah, I've painted a fairly grim picture of the developments, but I think there are some positives here, and this is where we ought to spend the next period of time, in my view, trying to make things better. And let me just tick off a few of the hopeful things that have happened. In late October, there was a meeting between President Trump and President Xi Jinping in Busan, a historic place in South Korea in the Korean War, but I won't go into it. But the two presidents met there, and they actually agreed. Now, agreements have been made and unmade with remarkable rapidity in the last year or so. But nonetheless, the two at this meeting had some agreements. One of the agreements was to try to relax, and meaning reduce somewhat some of the trade tariffs that the United States has imposed on China, and indeed most of our allies as well, although the tariff rates are higher on China, generally speaking. So there's some temporary improvement of that situation. Also, the Chinese were imposing export limitations on rare earths and magnets, inputs into the EV industry and weapon systems and aviation and space. And China, in responding to Trump's reduction of tariffs, made some moves on tariffs, but also at least temporarily eased up on some of its export controls. We're trying to see how well China actually lives up to that, and I'm sure they're trying to see how well we do. But be it as it may, there was some trade progress. It's fairly tenuous, and I don't want to oversell the point. Secondly, they agreed to an agenda of quite aggressive agenda of presidential meetings over the next year. And we'll see the two presidents presumably next year for sure get together, once in China and once in China and once in the United States. There may be two more meetings. That's, I would say, a little less clear to me, but people have talked about that. And they seem to get together on the telephone with a somewhat frequently. And I take basically head of state to head of state direct communications, generally speaking, I think are to be desired. And therefore, I'm hopeful that those meetings in the next year will produce something worth talking about. They also agreed that our two militaries, which haven't talked much at all, even though we're both now, China has the world's biggest ship and naval building campaign, has the biggest navy by ship count. Now, ship count doesn't take into account quality, so we need to take that into account. But in any case, our two militaries have been growing and repositioning in Asia, and we really need to have our militaries talking to each other to avoid an accidental conflict or any other number of things that our militaries need to understand each other's thinking, like it or not. Certainly, another thing that's come out of that Busan meeting is the United States was putting very heavy export controls on computer chips, particularly very high-end computer chips, and we've now at least lowered the threshold a little in the area of NVIDIA high-capacity chips that the security community is very worried about, and there's a fight about that. But the point is that Trump downplayed, I would say, the alarm that some technology people have about supplying those chips to China. He lowered the threshold, I think, hoping to create a more workable and productive economic relationship with China. We'll see whether that was wise or not. Another thing in their get together in Busan last fall was they didn't mention Taiwan much. And that both is, to my way of thinking, on one hand, a good thing because it means that they found a way to push that issue away from the center, and it's been so intractable for decades. So that part of it's good. On the other hand, the fact that Trump doesn't talk much about Taiwan might lead the Chinese to think he doesn't care much about Taiwan. And if the Chinese think they have a freer hand, they're inclined to push Taiwan around. So, Taiwan, the absence of a discussion, has its good points and its bad points, and we need to keep that in mind. So, Trump, Xi got together, did a lot. We'll see how it goes. Some people are more skeptical than the others, but it seems to me at least an effort to try to push things in a more positive direction. Another thing that's happened recently, and I think offers some hope along with this summit, is that the Chinese had every year they have their central committee meeting get together in plenary session. It's called a plenum. And in October, they had their fourth plenum, meaning fourth annual uh, plenary meeting. And every fifth year, they have a new party congress and so forth. So this is the fourth out of 5 or 6 meetings. It seems to me there's a conclusion you can reach from the last party meeting. And that party meeting, it seems to me, on China's part, concluded that the China is got lots of problems at home, and China's got to deal with its problems at home, and it needs no more problems abroad. So, the broad implication from my reading of the documents of this meeting is the Chinese would like to cool the external environment, devote less efforts to having to deal with what they would view as U.S. containment and U.S. trade policy and so forth. So they want to, it seems to me, pacify the outside world so they can take care of domestic problems. And of course, if you listen to Trump and the domestic debate here, there are many people that want to limit commitments abroad so they can take care of problems at home. So, in my view, we may be at a moment where, for their own separate reasons, each society would like to cool it with the other so they can devote themselves to higher priority things. If that's true, and of course, whether it proves true or not will depend on how we each react now. Uh, I would like to test that proposition. Are we both anxious to minimize external frictions so we can focus on our internal? So, to be determined, but it seems to me we may have that kind of moment of opportunity that's worth talking about. I would say also, we here in the United States, we put it in terms of expectations for the next election and how our election's going to go. And all of this is of great interest to the world and not least China. But China has its own succession problems, and Xi Jinping is 72 years old. And in fact, he has got no designated successor. And so it always raises the question as your leaders age, well, first of all, what's the quality of their aging? That's a problem. But also, what's the plan for a successor? And as far as we can see, there is no plan, which means that internal competition and political infighting will get more intense as people begin to look at the perishability, so to speak, of the leader, in this case, Xi Jinping. So I think the whole idea of succession in China means that they don't really want any more external pressure as they think about how to move forward in an era without the current leader. So I think that's to be talked about. Another kind of interesting thing, and I don't know exactly what to make of it, is the Chicago Council on Foreign Relations, which is a very um, credible institution and a longstanding poll on American attitudes towards other countries and their attitudes towards us. They had a poll in 2025, November, that shows, and here's what it said, a majority of Americans, 53%, now say the United States should undertake friendly cooperation and engagement with China. And that's up from 40% the year before. So if this is not just a blip, but is actually a trend, it kind of reinforces the logic that Americans are trying to look for a more productive relationship with China. They don't want a conflict. They think they have more problems than they need already. And if that sentiment catches on and is politically potent, it means that maybe sentiment in America is at least easing off to some extent. Now, this is the only poll I'm aware of that says exactly that. So it may be in error. It may turn out to be a one-time blip. But I think between how the Chinese were talking at their fourth plenum and this kind of evidence, and certainly it seems Trump isn't looking for a fight with China, maybe there's an opportunity to make some positive steps. So that raises the question of what might be positive steps. What could we do? I think the first thing we have to say is that we've got to be clear about the one China policy. We may not be happy with the fact that Taiwan's 95 miles away from 1.4 billion people who think Taiwan was to revert to China after World War II. But the fact is, the Chinese are committed to the proposition Taiwan is a part of China. And we've got to find a way to not to discourage the Chinese from using force without precipitating an attack on Taiwan or other unfriendly policies. So the current Taiwan policy has always been somewhat debated, but it's been a, let's put it this way, it's been the most effective way we know of squaring the circle. That is a Taiwan that has control over its day-to-day affairs, but we don't support the kind of independence that would trigger a war and be potentially suck us and Japan in, devastate probably Taiwan, and represent basically a conflict between two nuclear powers, the United States and China. So we want to avoid that. So be careful on Taiwan. I think there is a formula that can at least do that for the next period of time. So one China policy. Second, Japan and China have a very tenuous relationship, even under the best of circumstances. There will not be peace in Asia if Japan and China are at each other's throat. And of course, because of our alliance with Japan, we could be dragged in to anything that happens between Japan and China. So we've got to urge both China and Japan to cool it with respect to each other. And in the last month, it's complex. Maybe we can talk about it in the Q&A. We should encourage both powers to cool their jets on the cross in the East China Sea, where they have territorial disputes and also differences over Taiwan policy. So that's certainly the second thing. Another thing is that in the past, with the Biden administration and the Trump administration, we closed two consulates, one in each country. In Chengdu, out in the West, we closed our consulate there, and in the United States, China was directed to close its consulate in Houston. It seems to me that you've got to get your diplomats talking to each other. You got to make sure it's convenient for people to get visas and travel back and forth. You're not going to have more understanding if you have fewer diplomats and fewer people engaging with each other. So it seems to me there are reasons that the consulates were concluded or closed, but they're not compelling reasons to me, and I think we ought to do that. Just to wind up, I guess what I'm really trying to say is that war between China and the United States isn't a computer game. It's not an algorithm, to play around with. The first Cold War with China had enormous casualties. It had enormous economic inefficiencies. Much of the world was in bad shape because of it, and we don't want to repeat that. So I think we're at a moment where no guarantees. We can be disappointed, but maybe we're at a moment where the Chinese and the Americans can make some positive proposals and some progress. Well, Joan and Hyen, I hope I didn't go on too long.
That was fantastic. Thank you so very much. We have a couple of questions in the Q&A stacked up, so we'll get started with those. How can the U.S. take back manufacturing and deficit spending to China? It seems that China has a large amount of U.S. assets. Is there a number that indicates how much China has and also owns in the United States?
Well, several questions. One, how much do they own? And there are figures, and it breaks down to Chinese investment in the U.S. On the one hand, it also breaks down on how much land, farmland, for example, do the Chinese. So there are figures, and my figures may not be the most up to date. But on Chinese investment, really since COVID, remember part of the problems we have stemmed from COVID, and then this dynamic of arms race and retaliation and state legislatures passing legislation and Congress. All this is kind of snowballed. But investment, just not to put too fine a point on it, Chinese investment in the US was really rapidly growing before COVID. And then between COVID and the problems I've described, it's fallen off a cliff. Chinese investment now is negligible. And it's not just because the Chinese feel, they could get expropriated or any number of things. And it's not just reflective of the problems I described, but also China has its own problems and its own people ask, why invest in the United States that's trying to contain us when we have problems at home and need our investment at home? So, the Chinese have politics too. So investment has fallen off a cliff for a lot of reasons. We also have a foreign investment in the United States commission run by the Treasury Department that is obliged to look at if Chinese make investments, want to buy firms, want to merge. It's getting more and more difficult because they are trying to protect security and make sure technology, sensitive technology, doesn't flow to China. So the Chinese have their reluctance to invest here, and we have our fears of their investment. And then it's just the general atmosphere plus domestic politics in both our countries. Now, you asked, how's manufacturing doing? I think, basically speaking, you know, a modern economy tends to grow by having more and more services. So, us being an advanced economy, we have a long-term, and because of robots and automation, a long-term move away from manufacturing employment and even manufacturing as a share of GDP. And that's what I would say normal development is. But manufacturing's actually been hurt by the tariffs. And that may sound strange. You would think throw up a tariff, keep the other guy's product out. and you should be at least in deficit terms in better shape, and you protect your manufacturing. But so many of our imports now are raw materials or semi-finished goods for our manufacturing industry. So our car companies that assemble the cars here in many cases still have to import all the or a lot of the steel and other inputs that go in. So if you put up tariffs or raise the cost of your parts for your car, you're raising the car's cost to you. So ironically, we're hurting manufacturing through policies the administration thinks is to enlarge it. So I would say both modernization of the economy and moving towards services, plus misguided tariff policies, plus discouraging investment abroad is sort of a trifecta of bad ideas.
Thank you. Regarding each society, you had mentioned cooling the relationships to focus from their external to focus on their own issues. It seems that Trump administration often frames the internal U.S. social problems as a result of external factors such as imports, immigrants, such as etc. And will continuing to do so deteriorate the relationship further?
Well, yes, it's complicated in many dimensions, but basically, the Chinese population and the Chinese propaganda apparatus, for lack of a better name, uh, they are painting the United States as a dangerous place to go. And I started my talk by noticing there weren't many Western tourists in China or Western faces. But the Chinese are instructing their own people that the United States gun violence is one aspect of this, but the way foreigners in the United States are treated is worrisome to the Chinese people and government. We had before COVID, we had 375,000 Chinese students in the United States. Now, at last count, we have about not 375, but about 250,000 maybe. And that may be fewer in the future. And much of it is because parents in China are telling their kids go somewhere else. And or also education's getting better in China, so people feel they have more of a choice to stay in China and get a decent education. But you are seeing it in student numbers, and students might at one level sound like not the biggest problem, but students before COVID, foreign Chinese students studying in American universities and colleges was a 15 billion industry. That's as big as Boeing exports were at the time. So, and soybeans, they all hit in at about 13 and 14 billion dollars. So if you start chiseling away at China retaliates on students, China retaliates on soybeans, which your part of the country knows well, and doesn't buy Boeing aircraft, you've just damaged a lot of manufacturing and employment and exports. So I would say, but the basic anti-foreign tenor of what's going on is making it hard for us to compete when it comes to attracting people to come to the United States for whatever reasons. And, like it or not, immigrants have fueled economic growth because initially, as they get their feet on the ground, they have to take jobs and they work themselves up and get better over time. But they initially often have to take jobs that are that longer term residents of the American don't want to. So I think we're in a really unfortunate set of policies as far as economic growth. And I'd just add one other thing. A lot of, as far as Chinese people were concerned not so long ago, American universities were the top of the line uh, just right across, and certainly STEM fields. Well, we're now excluding a lot of students who are in certain areas of STEM. That's one thing. I think we got these interlocking policies, but they all end up making us less attractive.
So, kind of along the same line, is it true that China offered to invest US $1 trillion in advanced manufacturing in the US? Feels that this may be just a rumor that emerged from the pre-Trump C meeting in Madrid?
Well, I have to confess, I don't know the truth and falsehood of all the related promises and not and undid promises and who's living up to what. I think there's a big fog there. Uh, but long and the short of it is, I don't think it's my understanding of a lot of these promises for future investment. In other words, Trump imposed these tariffs, and then in the bilateral negotiations, he's tried to induce, as if he lowers tariffs, will they increase investment in the U.S.? And my understanding is many firms and countries already had plans to invest. So they just aggregate all of their future plans and then package it as a quote promise to invest. So I got to admit, I'm a little jaded on how real this is, or put it this way, how much of it's new investment. That's the first question. And the second is, as things change, investment plans change. Even if people today say we're going to invest, if the U.S. has higher and higher unemployment and the economy is less promising for foreign investors, well then their investment plans will change no matter what they said. So I hope for the best.
Um, as do I. Thank you. I believe you argued for clarification of the one China policy and an endorsement of a strategic ambiguity.
Ambiguity.
Excuse me, I'm having talking problems today. That is the MO for decades. Did I misunderstand you, or are you perhaps saying that affirming ambiguity is in fact the clarification that's needed?
Ex- well, yes, reaffirming ambiguity, because what that means is that our policy has been to express interest in China and opposition to the use of force, but never have absolute clarity about what we would do if the Chinese used force. The idea is we want to deter the Chinese from attacking or embargoing or using non-peaceful means against Taiwan. So we threaten that everything's on the table, right? We might intervene if China gets too coercive. But on the other hand, we have Taiwan, and the more we assure Taiwan that we will come to their rescue, we've always been afraid Taiwan will use that as their magic shield and become provocative. And we don't want Taiwan to declare independence de jure because we know the PRC will attack. So we're in this awkward position of trying to deter the Chinese from attacking, but not being so uh, crystal clear about our response that Taiwan then pushes the limit and elicits a really bad response. So we're moving back towards that policy, I think. Now, the other part of this policy is how much do you urge caution on Taiwan not to be provocative? And they have a relatively new leader, Lai Ching-te, and it's complicated, but basically his heart's on independence. He managed to try to control his expressions of that, but the Chinese believe he's an independence guy, and in his heart, that's probably not too wrong. So, in any case, and before we had a president in Taiwan that was pushing the limit, Chen Shui-bian was his name. And George W. Bush in 2003 at the White House admonished him for reckless tampering with the status quo. In other words, he said, don't cause trouble. And so Trump seems headed in that direction, but we're not exactly sure. So that meeting that I just talked about in Busan, what was interesting is neither side talked much at all about Taiwan. It was almost as though they said, let's just leave sleeping dogs lie, which really is kind of been our policy all along. So it's complicated, but if the U.S. comes out too strongly in favor of Taiwan, then we upset China, and if we pacify China, then we worry Taiwan. So what I guess my message is we got to be real careful here.
We are at time. We have one person who wanted you to repeat the survey that you mentioned during the talk about Americans having a more positive attitude towards China relations. I
Uh-huh.
think you said Chicago Council, is that right?
Right. It was their study of November 2025, so last month. And the quote is they're reporting they have tables and graphs and everything. So this is the verbal summary of their findings. Quote, a majority of Americans, 53%, now say the United States should undertake friendly cooperation and engagement with China. And that's up from 40% in 2024. So what it means is about 13% in their study of Americans became, from the previous period, became more favorable to engagement and friendly policies. Now, really increasingly since 2010, the word engagement and friendly have not been the sort of dominant words describing public attitudes. And of course, if you go back to 1989 and Tiananmen massacre and man in front of tank in Tiananmen, all that set of images has really negatively affected American views going all the way back to 1989. So if suddenly you start having people have a more, let's say, favorable view of engagement, uh, if that were to become a trend rather than a one point on a graph, uh, that would be meaningful. And I think it would be part of that movement where I said people want to solve problems at home, not get entangled abroad.
Thank you. Thank you, Professor Lampton, for your fascinating discussion today. And thanks to all of you who joined us for support of the China Center and the Considering China webinar series. A special thanks to Kai Mei and Joseph Terry for their generous support of this program. We invite you to continue to help us provide engaging programming like this with a link to our gift to the China Center. You can find a link on our webinar announcement or on our website. I wish everybody a very happy holiday season and a wonderful new year. And I highly recommend that you spend the holidays reading Living U.S. China Relations from Cold War to Cold War from Professor Lampton. It's a really good autobiographical historical read. I really enjoyed it. Thank you so
Thank
much.
you. Thank you and your audience so much.